This past fall, in part because of the parenting class that Drew was leading in the fall, Lauren decided that she was going to start waking up early, well, earlier than she would have liked, in order to eat breakfast with our children before school and do a devotional time with them during that breakfast time. So Lauren would get up at 6:30 and go upstairs and lead our kids in this time. She was using, or still is using, a book called Core 52, which you may have heard of. There's a kind of an adult version of Core 52. It's 52 kind of studies of the Bible, 52, because you can do one a week. It's not too late to start, in case you're curious. But there's a family edition, and the family edition uses a 10-minute devotional time. And over the course of the week, each week, the family learns a new Bible verse together. As you can imagine, the first one is Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. And each lesson, there's hand motions to go with it to try and make it easier for the kids to remember. And so Genesis 1:1 says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Boom. That was it. That was and what was, I will confess to you that as the know-it-all seminarian, I tried to remember Genesis 1:1 in Hebrew, because if we recited Genesis 1:1 through maybe verse 4, I forget, in our Hebrew class, we got extra credit. I had to look it up. Sorry, Dr. Bembry, I have not remembered the Hebrew. I remembered that the first word was Bereshit, and that was about all I had. So, the really touching moment, though, came a couple weeks later. After the family had started this time, a couple weeks later, we have this kind of, it makes me uncomfortable that this makes me frustrated. So, I confess to you that I'm sorry about this. Our kids fight over who gets to say the prayer at dinner time. And I will confess to you that while I love that my children want to pray, it is very annoying to have to arbitrate whose turn it is every day. But the really sweet moment came where one day we asked who wants to pray, and Matthias said, 1:1. 1:1. He wanted to say the memory verse. He wanted to say, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He's 2. It took us a little bit of time to figure out what one meant. His enunciation's not always clear. What is wa? Oh, 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Perhaps you noticed that our gospel reading from John opens with the same words. In the beginning. In the beginning, John says. In fact, the words that John opens his gospel with are the words NRK, the Greek words in the beginning. These are the same 2 words that opened the Greek translation of the Old Testament called the Septuagint. What I mean is the Old Testament and the New Testament, in John's gospel, the Old Testament and John's gospel opened the same way. In the beginning. In fact, the name for the first book of the Bible in our Bibles, Genesis, that's the Greek name for this book. It means the beginning. The Hebrew name for this book of the Bible was that word I said a minute ago, Bereshit, which means in the beginning. For whatever reason, at some point, we just stopped translating the titles of the books of the Bible into our language, and we said, that's good enough. And so now we're left with names like Genesis instead of the beginning. If we translated that, the first book of our Bible would be the beginning. That's what that means. I tell you this because I need you to understand that when John opens his gospel with these words, in the beginning, NRK, the people of his community who were Jewish, who knew the Old Testament, they would see what he was doing. They would know immediately the callback that he is making. This is an intentional decision. It would be like opening a movie today with a blaring high B flat. You would immediately expect Star Wars. You wouldn't know why, but that's what you would expect as the high B flat came through after the Fox fanfare. Or perhaps if you opened a book and it began with, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, you would ask, if you remember high school English, am I reading Charles Dickens? You see, if I opened a book that started that way, you would think, okay, does this book have anything to do with the French Revolution? Does this have anything to do with the Tale of Two Cities? John is making an intentional decision here. He wants his readers to think about Genesis. He wants his readers to think about the creation of all things, because John is writing a new beginning. He's writing from the beginning. I love to think that someone said, okay, John, give us the story of Jesus, but start at the beginning. And he said, okay, we're going to go back to creation. And they're thinking, that's a lot further back than I intended for you to start. But he does. He tells the story of how things began. He says everything began through this Word who was with God and was God. And now we have to see as well that in the book of Genesis, the beginning of the book of the Bible, the beginning of the story, it does begin with creation, but it very quickly moves to a description of how things got messed up. Genesis very quickly moves to there was sin, and this is the result, and this is what happens because of sin, and the rest of the story of the Bible is set in motion because of how the world got broken. How did creation fall apart? That is how Genesis opens. That's what Genesis is really focused on, is describing the fractured relationship between humanity and God. John's beginning has that in mind, right? John's a human. He knows brokenness. John's beginning has brokenness in mind, but his focus is a little different. Because John's focus is on how God has begun to put the world back together. John's focus, here as we see in John 1:10, it's okay, Anne-Marie, you can leave that up, thank you. John's focus pivots, has this turning point where it says, he was in the world and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave them power to become children of God, who were born not of blood or of the will of the flesh, or of the will of man, but of God. You see, very early in John's prologue, we call John chapter 1, we call this part the prologue. He's setting the stage for what to expect in the rest of his story. He tells us that in the beginning was the Word, that Jesus was in the beginning. But unlike Genesis, which focuses on how we fall apart, John's going to tell us about how things get put back together. John's going to tell us a story about how Jesus is putting the world back to right. How Jesus offers us promise and hope. John says that God is reconciling the world to those who receive him, who welcome him. Jesus gives power to become children of God. This is incredible. This is incredible promise that we are given. But we have this unfortunate moment where John says, the world did not know him. The world didn't know him, he tells us. I thought a lot about that word this week, know. I mean, what knowing is knowledge in general is such an abstract thing that this passage can be hard for us to understand unless we sit with it for a little bit. I mean, what does it mean to know someone or know something? Well, knowing something, that's hard to really put our fingers on what that means. Right? Even if you and I both know a third person, we might say we both know this person. And then we might say, yes, but I grew up with that person, so I know them better than you. So what does knowledge mean? What does it mean to know Jesus? What does it mean to know the Word? What does it mean to know God? Well, the word that John uses here, it can mean to discern or distinguish or understand. That's helping us get an idea of what this means. The word that I like for its meaning, though, is the word recognize. He was in the world, but the world did not recognize him. The world did not recognize who Jesus was. Now, it doesn't help that all throughout the Gospels, Jesus is healing people and going, okay, now don't tell anybody who I am. You're like, well, wait, well, don't we, aren't we supposed to recognize you? Yeah, but don't tell anybody. But the world did not recognize Jesus. And so it's no wonder that they didn't welcome him into their homes, into their life. Not many of us let strangers into our homes. Not many of us receive people we do not recognize. And because the world did not recognize, did not understand, did not discern, did not know Jesus, they did not welcome him. It's understandable that they did not recognize Jesus. God can be hard to recognize, right? We're in the last Sunday of Christmastide. The whole season of Christmas is built on a story, on the truth. I don't mean to imply anything, but on the story that Jesus came in a pretty odd way, to put it nicely. That's not what gods are supposed to do. Gods aren't born in stables in backcountry places where shepherds are the first ones to hear about it. Gods aren't dedicated at temples where the only people who recognize him are two old people. Gods aren't visited quietly at home by foreign kings. Gods should come and kings should bow immediately. I mean, Christmas is all about how God does things in hard to understand ways, in hard to recognize ways, in hard to discern ways. And we know, as I've already hinted a little bit, that the rest of the story progresses similarly. Right? Jesus doesn't put things back to right the way they expected. There's bloodshed, but not the bloodshed they expect. There's death, but not the people who they expect to die. There's good news, but it comes to weird people on the underside of society. You see, the story of Jesus is all a story about a hard-to-recognize God doing amazing things right under our noses that we don't always see. Christmas is about how God does things inconspicuously sometimes. I once heard someone describe the Bible as Acts 1 and 2 of a 3-act play. 3-act plays it's a pretty traditional way to write a play where you have 3 major sections of a story. And they made the joke that the hard part is that the 3rd act of this play is being improvised. We don't have the script for the 3rd act. But if you know anything about improv or theater, you know that 3-act plays only work when the 3rd act is consistent with Acts 1 and 2. Nobody likes the rug pull where the 3rd act feels unrelated. And my point here is that if God will act inconspicuously in Acts 1 and 2, as he tells us he does, it should not surprise us when God continues to act inconspicuously at times today, in the 3rd act, as we try to figure out where God is moving. God doesn't do this in a deceitful way. He's not playing some game with us. In fact, in John 5, Jesus tells us that he and the Father are always at work. So there's plenty of work to see. The problem is ours. We don't recognize the work. We don't understand the work. We don't discern the activity. We don't distinguish it for what it is, grace upon grace. John wants us to recognize the work of God. That's what his gospel is all about. He's the only, one of the only gospel writers who tells us why he writes his gospel. At the end of the gospel, he says, I've written these things down so that you may come to believe. There's the thesis statement. Here's why I wrote these down for you. I want you to recognize. I want you to believe. I want you to welcome Jesus. That's why John writes his gospel. And so all the miracles that are done in John are called signs because they point to a deeper power. They point to a deeper truth. They are helping us discern and recognize. You see, John wants us to recognize Jesus so that we can become children of God. In fact, John tells us that this is the reason Jesus came at all. He says, no one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known. Jesus, right? Part of what we see here is Jesus says, hey, sometimes it's hard to recognize God, so I'm going to go act. I'm going to go do things. I'm going to go live. I'm going to go show them what God looks like. If we've seen Jesus, we've seen God. John is showing us Jesus so that we can see God. John wants us to recognize Jesus because Jesus is the beginning. Jesus is the beginning. Jesus is also the eventual end. Right? The end will be signaled by the triumphant return of the Son, who comes back to what is his own, the world. And at that time, we will recognize and know him in a way that we cannot today know, and that will be a glorious day. We often find God hard to recognize because we want bold, big, audacious action. I can't think of a more bold or audacious task than recreating the world, which is what God promises that he will do. He's putting the world back. He's recreating it. This is a re-beginning, a re-genesis, a regeneration. But sometimes the darkness feels too oppressive. We're told the light overcomes the darkness, but sometimes it doesn't feel that way. Sometimes God's actions feel like his grace is empty for us, even though we're told it's full upon full. Sometimes God isn't doing what we expect, what we desire. And when that happens, we struggle to recognize Jesus. But John promises us, the promise of this passage is twofold. The first promise is that Jesus is with us. The whole focus of Christmas is that, as we sang today, Emmanuel, that word means God with us. The whole focus of this season is a reminder that we are with God. God is with us. Jesus comes to us not because of anything we have done. And he says, will you welcome me? Will you receive me? And if you do, he says, you will become a child of God. You will be regenerated. I have a confession to make, another one. Apparently, I'm very introspective today. I decided I was preaching this passage, before I left on my Christmas vacation. And I was thinking about this passage between Christmas and New Year's and sat down in the office on Friday to really put the thoughts on paper. And I was like, I feel like I preached this last year. And I went back and, I realized that I did preach John chapter 1, the first Sunday of 2025. I was like, interesting. It feels like a good place to start a year, though, doesn't it? I mean, John says in the beginning, and I will tell you that as I start 2026 with you, as I start this year, if I had one thing that I want to grow in this year, right? It's the time where we make resolutions that last a week. But if I have one resolution that I hope lasts longer than that, the resolution that I have is that I hope 2026 is a year where I get better at recognizing God's work around me. I hope that in December, when I reflect on 2026, I think, man, I really saw God act in ways that surprised me. I really learned how to discern what God was up to. I really learned how to watch what God was doing. And not for anything that I gain, but just so that I can marvel in the glory of the Son, the only Son of the Father. I have to remind you that we don't do anything to achieve Jesus' presence. We are told that he created the world, that it was created through him, and then he came. Not because of us or what we've done to earn it, but because he wants us to be children of God. I invite you with me on this journey this year. May we be a church that over the year gets better at recognizing the work of God around us. It will be inconspicuous at times. There will be times where we think, God, why didn't you do that more boldly? Why didn't you do that more obviously? Why didn't you do that bigger or better? But if we can learn to recognize Jesus, we will learn ever more how to welcome, how to receive him, and what it means to be children of God. That is my prayer for 2026. God, we thank you for bringing us safely into another year. We know that years and calendars are arbitrary, and yet they matter to us. And so we're grateful that you've brought us here. Father, it is my prayer that over this year we will get more aware of the work you're doing around us, that we will better recognize your activity, your presence, your nearness. And as we do so, Lord, it is my confidence that we will learn more about your love and more about your grace, which we are told is full upon full. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.